Hello, everyone. Good day. We're going to be continuing our lesson in this virtual class. Today, we're going to be talking about concept and relationship of listening and speaking. This is the first one. It's mostly focused on listening, as we have discussed earlier that to engage in speaking, one must first master listening. Si input muna bago si output. Okay, so let's proceed. Okay, what is the nature of offline and online learning? Okay, in our courses in listening and speaking skills have a prominent place in language programs around the world today. Okay, so it's quite common for you to be encountering English language in most parts of the world. Okay, so with this, there is a deemed demand on speaking the language. Okay, so we start with listening skills regarding this language. Okay, so to have a good foundation on the topic, we have to have a clear understanding of the nature of offline and online in macro skills. Okay, what is online and offline nature in macro skills? How do we benefit from both? Okay, how does receptive and expressive macro skills interact with offline and online nature? How does online and offline nature affect the discourse? Okay, so what is offline and online? Okay, to put it simply, when we talk about offline and online, offline has no direct interaction with the discourse, and online has a direct interaction with the discourse. So what is the main difference? It's time. Okay, so what do you mean by no direct interaction with the discourse? Offline are informations that you gather without the person present. I mean, without you talking to anybody. Okay. So, like reading a book, okay, like reading a book, you are not actually directly interacting with the writer, but instead with the text. So, that is offline. Okay. One more thing is online activities such as talking, communication, talking with your friends. These are classified as online processes in communication. Okay, so we have two types. We have offline and then online. Okay, when you write, when you read, those are offline. When you talk to somebody, when you listen to someone talking, when you talk to that person, that is considered as online. Bakit po ganon? Bakit time ang difference? Okay, when we talk about time, it's not the time whether the message is delivered and message is sent, but the time in the processing. Okay, the way we process the information during that period. Okay, um, to put it simply, when we talk about to our friends, our feedback, diba tandaan nyo yung communication process, we have feedback for the last step. That is given at an immediate time. Okay, instantaneous. Okay, when we talk about it. So in this concept, um, offline re- requires the person, not actually requires, but actually gives the person more time to think about the discourse. Okay, so this is also the reason why it's hard to actually master speaking fluently. Why is that? Because it's always online. Okay? Online po yung message. That's why when we process information, it should be instantaneous. Dapat mabilisan. Di ba doon nahihirapan kung bakit mahirap ang extempo? Okay? That's why few people can only do extemporaneous speech. It's because of this concept of time. Okay? Unlike in writing, we have sufficient time to actually think about what we are going to be writing. However, in speaking or in online processes, we have to do it instantaneously on that moment. Okay? Unless nating prepare mo siya. Diba? You memorize a speech and then there's no problem. It's just a matter of remembering the speech. But conversations, is hard. Well, why is it hard? Because the reaction would vary according to the feedback given to you. That is why online processes are a bit harder than offline processes. Also, one more difference is the editing, okay, or the filter, okay. In online messages, in online processing, you cannot edit what you have just said. Nasabi mo na siya. Hindi mo na siya pwedeng bawion. I-correct mo man, still the message was there. Okay? Unlike in writing, you are given the chance to edit it. Also in reading, you're given the chance to think about it for a few moments or even a couple of days. Diba? However, a direct message, let's say hinapot ka, you should answer. You cannot delay the response there. Okay? So, let me show you. Yeah. Okay. How does this offline and online interact with receptive and interactive? Okay. On the first part, we discussed the receptive skills, which is the reading and listening, and then the expressive skills or the output, the writing and speaking. So we have categorized this as offline and online. Okay. We have the offline. This entails messages that could be decoded and encoded in a longer period of time. Okay. Online messages, this entails messages that could be decoded and encoded. It should be shorter period of time. Okay, shorter period of time. Insigida siya. How does this concept of offline and offline affect messages? Solely on the time frame. Okay, basically it's on the time frame they process is. The less the time frame, the less the quality of the processing is. This is one of the reasons why public speaking is quite difficult to master, as the speaker needs to consider huge amount of factors in delivering the message. Okay, when we go back to our purposive communication, okay, or oral communication in your senior high school, it entails way more factor compared to reading and writing. Okay, some students would find reading and writing a bit easier compared in comparison with speaking. Diba? Based from my experience, it seems that students are more comfortable in writing in English, writing sentences, rather than just doing extemporaneous speeches. Okay, so basically that's the difference between the two. Why do we need this? Because we're going to be mentioning this all throughout the discussion. Okay, so why is offline and online messages need to be taken into consideration in teaching? This opens a new pedagogy in delivering this course. Okay, this consider the process involved. Okay, consider the content of the discourse, consider the instructional material. What do you mean by considering these factors? Okay, when we say this opens new pedagogy in delivering this course, remember, when you become teachers, okay, you have to consider the answers of the students. Let's say you require them to speak. Okay, recite something, you ask them a question, you can give a bit of leeway on grammar errors. Why is that? Because it's online. Okay, you don't have to be super strict in the in minor grammar errors, solely because it's online. Binigla mo siya ng question. So therefore, you give that person enough lower a bit your standards in speaking in English, solely because online po yun. Okay, hindi ganun kadali ang online. Okay? So next is consider the process evolve. Imagine the process of throwing a question to a student. Binigla mo lang, di ba? You ask the student, and then the student has to process the information, the sound that he or she receives, process that in their head, process an answer, translate that into English, and then deliver the message. Imagine that process. Okay? So wag pong masyadong ipe-pressure. That's one thing we should consider. Okay? Also consider the content of the discourse. When we listen to questions, do we understand the question wholly? Buo ba? Unlike in reading, you can read it several times, di ba? Ilang beses mo pwedeng basahin yung message, ilang beses mo pwedeng basahin yung question sa test. However, online messages or direct messages requires you only a few seconds of processing it, okay? So, pakarinig mo sa kanya, you already start processing. So, you you may encounter several errors in understanding the message. So you have to consider that. Also, becoming a teacher, you have to consider the instructional material that you're going to be using. Okay? Since messages or discourse degrades or depreciates in online processing, therefore you have to consider that in your instructional material. Tandaan natin, let's say you spoke a whole paragraph and then only expect that only 2 to 3 sentences will be remembered by your students. Okay, not the whole paragraph. So you have to consider your instructional material. This is also the reason why when we're making PowerPoint presentations, we should avoid writing full paragraphs in the PowerPoint presentation. Why is that? Sir, reading naman eh. Yes, it's reading, but it's only going to be flashed for a couple of seconds or minutes. That doesn't give the reader enough time to process the information. Okay po? So this is the concept of offline and online messaging. It opens a whole new factor that we have to consider in teaching. Okay, so let's proceed now. Teaching listening. Okay, so we are going to be having the nature and then also the teaching listening. So in teaching listening, we have only two types of listening. These are listening as comprehension and then listening as acquisition. Okay, so this is the two steps. Malalaman natin maya-maya kung bakit dalawa lang siya. Okay? We listening as comprehension or listening comprehension ang tawag natin lagi. This view of listening as comprehension is based on the assumption that the function of listening in second language learning is to facilitate the understanding of spoken discourse. Okay? Um, Listening as comprehension is a traditional way of thinking about the nature of listening. Indeed, in most methodology, manuals listening and listening comprehension is synonymous. Okay, same lang siya. Madangkadanggan listening comprehension or listening as comprehension, it's just the same. It's just iba-iba lang ang pag mention ng mga tao niyan. Okay? So, we will examine this view of listening in some details. Before considering a complementary view of listening as acquisition, dito muna tayo sa listening as comprehension because this is the phase one. We call this the phase one. Okay? So before actually entering that, we have to consider first basic review muna tayo bago tayo mag-dive in para same ang ating pagkakaintindi. Okay? So let's clarify this first before proceeding with listening as comprehension. Okay? We all heard of the bottom-up processing. Okay? The spoken discourse. We have bottom-up and then, of course, the top-down. Okay? Bottom-up processing, not bottom-up reading, but bottom-up processing. Bottom-up processing refers to using the um, incoming input as the basis for understanding. Okay? Comprehension begins with the data that has been received, which is analyzed as successive levels of organization. We have the sounds, words, clauses, sentences, and then lastly the text, okay? Until meaning is arrived at. Comprehension is viewed as a process of decoding. The listener's lexical and grammatical competence in language provides the basis for bottom-up processing. Okay? The input is scanned for familiar words and grammatical knowledge is used to work out the relationship between the elements of the sentence. Okay? So na-discuss na siya nung una, di ba? So hindi na muna tayo proceed na ba tayo sa sorry. Sorry. Should we proceed to top down? No, not yet, not yet. Okay, hold on to that idea. Later tayo gagalaw sa top down processing. Okay. First, let us sink in with the concept of bottom-up processing. What do we mean by this spoken discourse? To explain it further, have to we have to ask ourselves, what happens when we process raw speech? Okay? Sabihin natin nagkukwento ang friend mo. Okay? Your friend told you a story. Can you retell the story? Yes, you can. Diba? That's how we process it. We can retell the story. But the question is, can you retell the story exactly the way it was given? Word per word, even the pauses, even the intonation, accent. Can you do that? Di ba hindi? Mahirap. Why is that? Why is that? It has to do with the process. Okay? We remember, however, we remember in a different way. We remember in our own way. Okay? That's why chismis, di ba? Ang chismis, pansin natin, it has its original form, and then as it is passed down from different chismosas, it becomes a different story solely because of the process. Okay? We tend to not exaggerate, not intentional exaggerating it, but we tend to retell it in our own way. And retelling it in our own way, it deviates something from the original message. Okay? Baka ang pag sinabi mong makanuson, iba man sa makanuson kang recipient. Okay? I hope you're following. So, we have that errors in our processing. Okay? So, that's what happens when we process raw speech. Okay? Example of this. Let me give you an example. Okay? We have the original message. The guy I sat next to on the bus this morning was telling me he runs a Thai restaurant in Chinatown. Apparently, it's very popular at the moment. This is the original message. Okay? And then, pag pumasok na siya sa atin, it becomes this. We chunk it. It's called chunking because we chunk. Literally, we cut up the sentences into parts that we understand. Kasi medyo mahaba siya. Kung papansin natin, let's go back. Diba? The guy I sat next to on the bus this morning was telling me he runs a Thai restaurant in Chinatown. Apparently, it's very popular at the moment. So we cut this up into partial pieces. That's what's happening in our head. Okay. So the chunk message becomes the guy, okay, I sat next to on the bus when this morning. Okay. Anong ginigibo niya? He was telling me, what was he telling me? He runs a Thai restaurant in Chinatown. Apparently, it's very popular at the moment. Okay. That's how we process the information. That's what comes in our head. Okay. Medyo nginuya siya. Okay. Third step is the process utterance stored in memory. What do we now remember? What can we now remember from the original message? Ito na yung nai-input na sa utak natin. Okay? I was on the bus. There was a guy next to me. We talked. He said he runs a Thai restaurant. It's in Chinatown. It's very popular now. Okay? As you can see, each one has its own idea. Diba? I was on the bus. There was a guy next to me. We talked. He said he runs a Thai restaurant. It's in Chinatown. It's very popular now. Okay? We dissected the whole complex idea and made it into chunks of simple ideas that forms that complex idea. Diba? So that's what's happening in our head. Okay? So upon the example, let us try to look at how we actually do it. Okay? Sorry. This is not it. Okay. Okay. What do we do? Okay. First step is let's go back. Let's go back to the original message. Okay. The listener, okay, takes in raw speech and hold a phonological representation of it in working memory. Basically, the sound converted into words in your head. That's the first thing that happens to you. Okay. Next is they immediately attempt to organize the phonological representation into constituents, identifying their content and function. So from sound, you then move to its function. Okay. When you hear the word, um, let's say read. Okay. You heard the word read. So when you heard the word read, you hear the sounds r, e, d. Okay. Read. And then you process that. What is that word? Is what's its representation? Is it a verb? Okay? Is it a noun? Is it an adjective? Is it a conjunction? Kung ano ba siya? You categorize that now. Now, after categorizing, let's say you then decided it's a verb because the boy reads his book. So, read there is functioning as the action being done by the boy. Okay? Now, the next step is you identify each constituent and then construct underlying propositions. Okay? Building continually onto a hierarchical representation of the proposition. What do you mean by this? We then now build the concept. Okay? After understanding the sentence, we now give the meaning of the sentence. We build it up. Okay? From the original message, the guy I sat next to on the bus this morning, this is the sound and the function. This is the second step. Okay? Okay. We chunk it and then we attempt to organize the phonological representation into constituents. These are the constituents. Okay. Now, we then identify from this the underlying propositions. What do you mean by underlying propositions? This is the whole concept. Ano ba yung ugat ng kwento? Ano ba yung puso ng kwento? What's the core idea and concept of the message? And this is it. Okay, the part three. Okay, this is the core message. This is the information that you could get from the original message. Okay, now once you have identified the propositions for a constituent, ano na bang nangyayari dito sa message na to? What will happen here? After this, you are now going to store that in your memory. Just then you are going to be remembering this. Okay, so we can have four steps for this. Kasi bali dalawang step itong nangyari sa part 2. Okay? We have identifying parts and then we also have giving meaning to the parts and its function. Okay? So next is how do we improve this? Let me give you tips on how you improve this with your students because baka magdating ang panahon, yes, na-get niyo ang bottom-up processing, but how do you actually teach it? Okay? You help your students retain input while it is being processed. Okay? You recognize word and clause division. Okay? Recognize keywords, recognize key transactions in a discourse, recognize grammatical relations between key elements in sentences, use stress and intonation to identify word and sentence function. These are basic tips on how you can improve your bottom-up processing. Okay? So, yun. So, one more thing about bottom-up processing is it's quite common, no? It's quite common. Mapapansin natin to. When we recall back, let's go back, maybe hindi lang tayo aware na bottom-up processing ang ginagamit ng teacher para sa atin. But it's called bottom-up processing when you have experienced this. Okay? Many traditional classroom listening activities focus primarily on bottom-up processing. Okay? Exercises such as dictation, close listening, hindi po hindi po typo yan. It's really spelled with a Z. Okay? Close listening activities. Maybe hindi nyo lang alam na close listening ang tawag sa kanya. But sometimes you call it fill in the blanks. Diba? We have a sentence. I remember in your elementary days, okay? There's a sentence. What type, what's the proper tense? Diba? When you write, ano ang tamang tense bang gamitin sa sentence? Is it, or should it be singular or plural? Nakasulat sa baba yung dalawang sagot. One is singular, one is plural. And then you have to choose and write that on the blank. That's called close listening. Okay? Um, bonus question, bakit po Z ang ginamit dyan? Hindi SE. That's a bonus question. Plus 1 to your output. Plus 3 lang natin para masaya. Why is it spelled with a Z? Okay, one hint about that is Gestalt theory in your facilitating learning. Look into that. Malalaman nyo kung bakit Z yan. Okay, plus 3 sa makasagot nito. Okay. The use of multiple choice questions after a text and similar activities which require close and detailed recognition and processing of the input and which assume that everything the listener needs to understand is contained in the input. Example is your module. Diba? Everything that you need to answer, everything you need to answer questions in your module is written in your module. Okay. This is using bottom-up processing. Okay. So what is now top-down processing? Okay, top-down processing refers to predicting the outcomes of the discourse. Okay, encompasses reading between the lines. Okay, also encompasses cognitive and metacognitive processing involved. So medyo higher level na siya. So what happens in top-down processing? Okay, ano ba nangyayari pag nagta-top-down tayo? Okay, we have several steps that is happening in our top-down processing. The first is the cognitive process. The cognitive process are mental activities related to comprehending and storing input. So comprehension process is associated with the processing of linguistic and non-linguistic input. Okay, this entails understanding the language and paralanguage involved. Example of this is when a person is emotional about saying something. Okay, our comprehension process is the one identifying the value of the message. Okay. As we can remember in our TTL, also in our oral com when we were in senior high, also in our purposive communication, that paralanguage or nonverbal language plays a very important role in speaking as it entails more message than just your spoken discourse. Okay? Mas malaki ang makukuha mo sa non-verbal language from your gestures, your tone, your volume, and things like that. Okay? Um, mas marami ang message nun kaysa doon sa actual message. That's why we have to consider non-linguistic input as well. Next is also storing and memory processes associated with the storing of linguistic and non-linguistic input in working memory or long-term memory. You now then store it. Okay, this involves the step where knowledge attained by means of decoding a message will be sorted out if it belongs in the long-term or short-term memory. So dito yung point na mag-decide ka, should you store it in a short-term or long-term memory? Nag-smile si crush, pakasabing hi, good. Pag sabi mong good morning, nag-smile si crush. That would be stored in a long-term memory, di ba? Pero yung nakasalubong mo lang kung saan nag-hi yung tricycle driver or yung pedicab driver sa labas, then you can store that in your short term unless na-crush mo yon, di ba? So this is where we decide whether we store it in our long term or short term. Um, when listening to lectures, let's say like this, okay, when listening to videos like this, you tend to actually try your best to store it in a long term memory. 'Di ba? Pinipilit natin. Even sa klase, 'di ba? Ang bilis ni sir magturo, hindi ako makasabay. It's because the storing requires time. Okay? So you have to actually have ample time to understand it. So teach us when you become teachers, take it slowly. This is also my reason why I do this instead of actually requiring you to have a face to face and discuss this all throughout. It all has to do with the storing and memory processes. Okay. So that you could rewatch this video over and over again until you get it. Okay. So next is using retrieval processes. This is the cognitive, huh? It's not metacognitive. Retrieval processes is associated with accessing memory to be readied for output. Okay? Ngayon, sige, nag-smile si crush. You stored it in your long-term memory. Now, syempre, ikukwento mo. Nag-smile eh, ikukwento mo. Now you are going to be retrieving that memory and access that in your head. Okay? Before tackling retrieval, why don't we ask ourselves, okay, bakit ba hindi na lang natin i-store lahat? Why not just store everything in a long-term memory? Bakit hindi na lang natin i-memorize lahat? Bakit kaya? It's because it's not only storing, it's also the retrieval process. The more you store in your head, the harder it is to retrieve it. Garo, cellphone, okay? Takulong ka ng picture ni crush. Okay, takulong kang picture ni crush. Pero may hinahanap kang specific na picture. Medyo mahirap nang hanapin yon kasi 1,000 yung picture mo sa kanya. 'Di ba? But if we only choose specific events to store in our long-term memory, it's quite easier to browse through your schema. 'Di ba? Okay? So, let's now proceed to your metacognitive. Yan, okay? Oh, sorry. Sorry. Yan. Metacognitive processes. Okay? We have several things in the metacognitive process. We have assessing the situation. We also have monitoring. We also have self-evaluating and self-testing. Okay. So what do we mean by assessing the situation? Okay. Taking stock of conditions surrounding a language task by assessing one's own knowledge. Ano ba yun? Sinabi ko. You test, you check. Okay. You check the situation. First, do you understand every word of the word, every word of the sentence? Do you understand every sound? Can you understand the non-linguistic or the paralanguage demonstrated by the speaker? Naintindihan mo ba yung lahat? Okay? Bago ka pumasok dyan, may premonition ka na. Sir, judgmental? Yeah, yes, kind of like judgmental. No? We are judging the situation before we actually enter the conversation. Yeah, we do this, di ba? Ay, boring man yan si Sir Magtaram. Di ba, pag initial pa lang na arugad to, yun na to. I mean, you're not that interested in the message anymore. Di ba? So, yan, we assess the situation. Okay? After assessing the situation, we now proceed to monitoring. Okay? Monitoring. Monitoring determining it's basically determining the effectiveness of one's own and another's performance while engaged in a task. Okay? You check, monitor, no? Um, like let's say this video, okay? As I'm teaching you, I can see myself here in this camera. I monitor the effectiveness of my videos. Okay? So that's monitoring. You check now what you assess. Next is self-evaluating. Okay, determining the effectiveness of one's own and another's performance after after engaging in the activity. Yung isa during. Let's say I'm doing this video now. I'm looking at the camera right now. There's a little monitor below. I'm able to see what you are able to see right now. That is during my recording. And then self-evaluating is after I have recorded this, I will be editing this, chopping out parts that I do not like. That is self-evaluating. Okay. Also in metacognitive process, that's what you do when you listen to a message. Diba? Sometimes when we talk, we realize, oh, I think I used the wrong term. That's monitoring. Diba? And then after 1 hour, mali pala yung kwento ko. Then you did a self-evaluating. So that's the basic concept of monitoring and self-evaluating. Both are checking. It's just the question of when you are checking it. Monitoring is during, self-evaluating is after. Okay. Lastly is self-testing. You now test the effectiveness of your language. Okay? You now try to test what you have learned. Gagamitan mo na si nanonodan mo. Okay? We do this, di ba? After reading a story, We try to use what we have understood about the story. We try to apply it, we try to share it. That's self-testing. Not only does it share it not only does it help others, but it also develops your understanding of the concept. Okay, so I think we're ready now. We have understand bottom up and top down processing. Let's now proceed to listening as acquisition. So, may pinagkaiba ba? Listening as comprehension and listening as acquisition? Yes po. Comprehension is pagintindi lang. Acquisition is acquiring the language. Pagkatuto ng language. Specifically, in your terms, English. You're going to be English teachers. Okay? So, listening as acquisition. This approach to teaching of listening has been based on the following assumptions. Okay? Listening serves the goal of extracting meaning from the message. Okay, it's more focused now on the meaning of the message. Okay, in order to do this, learners have to be taught how to use both bottom up and top down processes in arriving at an understanding of message. That is the reason why we had a review on bottom up and top down processing for us to understand listening as acquisition. The language of utterances, example, the precise words, syntax, expression used by the speakers are temporary carriers of meaning. Okay? Once meaning has been identified, there is no further need to that's attend. Okay, need to attend to the form of messages unless problems in understanding occur. Okay, um, we this simply talks about the preciseness of the language use. Okay, we now focus more on its function. Okay, focusing more on its function, the preciseness of words, the syntax, the expression used by the speaker. We try to imitate that. Okay, we try to imitate and learn from that and then acquire it. Okay, next is teaching listening strategies can help make learners more effective listeners. Okay, so this is an example of listening. Red flags. Okay. What do you mean by red flags? Red flags are like a warning for you. When you become teachers, okay, when you become teachers, try to avoid, not necessarily this is banned. Hindi ko sinasabing bawal to. Pwede po ito. It's just that it's not ideal. You can think of a better way to do an activity. Dapat hindi ito kasama sa top 3 mo or top 10 mo. Last resort na to. Okay? First is dictation. Next is mimicry. Next is closed exercises. Why is that? Simply because this activity should be last resort as it gives too much emphasis on bottom-up processes than top-down ones. So what's wrong with that? Ano ba ang problema kung puro na lang bottom-up, konti ang top-down? Remember in your TTL 1, the 21st Century Learning Framework, the 4 C's. Okay, we have the 4 C's. That's creativity, critical thinking, communication, and then collaboration. Okay, when you remember the framework, the core framework of 21st century learning, it has media technology, learning and innovation, 4 C's na yun, life and career skills. These are the core ideas of teaching in the 21st century. So these three, the dictation, mimicry, and close exercises, does not fall under this. Bakit? This does not promote critical thinking. Hindi masyado nag-iisip. Because close exercises, may pilian. Mimicry, gagayahin mo lang. Dictation, isusulat mo lang yung naririnig mo without you understanding. Okay? So these activities should be the last priority. I'm not saying it's not good. It's just not ideal to be using it in classes. Okay? So we have, before we proceed to two steps, okay, we have to consider also classroom materials in our teaching as acquisition. Okay, um, materials need to have not necessarily need to have, but caters critical thinking rather than just copying and following. Okay? Like asking your students to tell a joke. Kasi po ang joke, pag ginaya na ang joke, baduy. 'Di ba? Kasi narinig na yun before. But creating something from it, kahit simpleng activity na humingi ka lang ng joke, a joke requires high level of metacognition. Bakit sir high level of metacognition? May punchline. Dapat matawa. Daming conditions, di ba? Even your non-linguistic, your para-language should be considered in telling the joke, di ba? That's a good way to actually have an activity. Madali lang yan, no? Ask a joke, original joke. You are now doing better than just doing mimicry or dictation. Okay? Also, bakit po red flags natin to? Bakit pala inire-red flag natin to? Rather than understanding the critical thinking of our students, what we are now teaching them is storing memory. Ano ba yung problema doon? Memorization. Okay? That's also the reason why when I make exams and test papers, I seldom ask for enumeration. Minsan sa quiz, I do that. But for exams, I never do that. Solely because I want to measure the critical thinking and understanding of the students rather than their capacity to memorize things. Okay? Hindi po nasusukat ang galing sa pag-memorize lang. Okay? You may have memorized the book, but if you don't understand the book, you learn nothing. Okay? So that's why we avoid this dictation, mimicry, and close exercises because this promotes memorization. I'm not very fan of that. Okay, we have two steps in listening acquisition. We have noticing or motivating activities. In your TTL1, if you can still remember, it's always the first step, motivation. Di ba? Pre-reading text, co-text, ay, that's pre-text, I mean not co-text, but pre-text. Diba? We have these activities. We need to have noticing and motivating activities. And after that, we have reconstructing activities. So what are noticing activities? This by far a great key in acquisition process. Okay? Producing stimulus, both familiar and unfamiliar. Um, the familiar stimulus would lead to interest, thus creating an open line. Okay, magiging online siya. I mean, open line siya towards the acquisition together with the unfamiliar. Basically, arag siya kani. Let me explain this in a very simple manner. Um, habo kang aki magkakan tama. Habo kang aki magkakaning gulay. Pero kaipuhan niya magkakaning gulay. Pero ang gusto niya lang pirming kakanon ay meat. So what do you do? Nagluto kang meat na may kadikit na gulay na nakahalo. Okay? So, padiit-diit mong isasalak si gulay duman sa laog, pag hungit kang aki, nagkakana siya ng meat, pero din siya aware na nakakakan siya ng gulay. That's basically the concept of motivating and noticing activities. We insert, we first present them with something very familiar, like love life, crush, teleserye, telenovela, those things, familiar in that, together with something unfamiliar. Bakit po? The familiar things that they are very interested in will open their mind, no? O magiging na silang open-minded kasi gusto mo yung idea eh. And then you then inject something unfamiliar to it. And after injecting something unfamiliar to it, unconsciously, nare-retain nila tong unfamiliar. Thus, increasing the schema, increasing the discourse, increasing the process. Nagagayon ang listening activity. Okay? So these are good examples of this is a good strategy. That's why we have motivation first at the start of the period. But remember, a motivation should be somehow connected, both containing familiar and unfamiliar concepts. Okay. Next is the reconstructing activities. Sorry, sorry. Next is the reconstructing activities. Reconstructing activities, these are activities cementing or petrifying the new acquired message into memory. Restructuring the activities are oral or written tasks. Okay, dito ko na siya let me use this opportunity to share with you the story behind modules. Diba? I see a lot of posts of students that is complaining about the activities. Grabe sir, activity, pasimbag sa ng pasimbag. Even my module, no? After seeing a discussion, below you will see an activity that you have to answer. Okay? Why is that? That is called reconstructing activities. Those are activities that reinforce the learning. Cementing the learning in your head. Grabing pag ginapagibong activity. Simply because we want you to retain what you have read, to practice it, to use it. Kaya remember, when you try to cheat with that and copy other people's answers, hindi kami nagagalit dahil kinopya nyo. Nagagalit kami kasi hindi mo ginamit yung natutunan mo. And if you don't use that, that will depreciate into your short-term memory. That is the reason for bombardments of activities. I'm not defending any teacher. This is theory, okay? The purpose of these activities is to reinforce you, to make you remember it better. Okay? So, yeah, that's the reason, no? We have the reconstructing activities. Why do we need to know this? Okay, bakit ba natin kailangan matutunan na? Um, I mean, when I say know this, I mean, why do we need to know bottom up, top down, um, listening as comprehension, listening as acquisition? Why do we need? Is it required in my subject? Somehow, yes. Pero mostly you're going to be English teachers. Bakit ba hindi grammar na lang pag-aralan natin? English teacher, di ba? We have to learn the process so that we can pinpoint where to teach our students. Kasi usually ang problema ganito, we don't have the knowledge to assess what's the problem of the students in terms of listening. Saan ba may problema? Attention ba? Is it really the attention? Although focus is a very key factor in listening, still attention is very broad. Paano mo i-fix yun? So we have to know this. We have to know the process. How is listening being um, processed in our head? What activities will help it? Okay, so this is why we need to know this to become better teachers, not only to learn more content but also to develop our pedagogy in teaching para mas maintindihan natin ang technique na gagamitin natin sa klase. Okay, so we have the phase one. Okay, the phase one is phonetic utterance of message, followed by segmented and chunk, followed by process utterance in chunk version, and store in memory as due utterance. Okay. Let me, yeah. Okay. Phonetic utterance. Wait, sorry. Okay. Phonetic utterance is the the message is processed based on the sound that we hear. Di ba the first step when we go up, listening as comprehension. Okay. Si sound, ginigibo mong kino-convert mo siya. You're decoding it into a message. Okay? From sound to message. Next is you segment it or chunk it. Okay? Chunking. Tig-chunk mo si idea. Di ba? Remember the cutting it part from part? After chunking it, you now proceed to process utterance in chunk version. After cutting it into pieces, you now try to understand each piece. Okay? Medyo madali na siyang intindihin kasi putol-putol na siya. And then after that, you then store it in memory as a new utterance. When we say as a new utterance, new part of your schema, new learning, those things, no? Tig-store mo na siya sa memory mo. This is the phase 1. Followed by phase of, obviously, syempre, ang sunod sa phase 1 ay phase 2, that is listening as acquisition. Okay? Now, listening as acquisition, remember in your, let's go back, oops, sorry, stored in memory as a new utterance will lead to using the stored memory as foundation. Okay? Remember, di ba, before we started this, I gave a review because I used your stored memory as a new, your previous memory to connect something new to it. Okay? This is something new. Okay? And then after that, we notice it. We use noticing. Okay? We connect the sorry. We look for something common and then we absorb it together with something uncommon with us or we are not knowing. And then after receiving that, we then restructure. Ano ba yung restructure, Sam? We then try to cement the message in our head. Okay? Di ba, when we look a bit earlier, hindi po eksaktong na-istoryan sa utak natin. Okay? We try to understand it in our own ways, in our own words. So with this, we have to restructure it from its original form. So, magbabago siya. In restructuring, it could have this one, two, three, four, five. Five things. No? What do you mean by it could have these five things? Five things could happen to the discourse, to the message, to the utterance. Okay? Remember from the sound, we end with this. So, mapili lang dyan sa raw kung ano mangyayari doon. So first, pwede siyang i-deconstruct. When we say deconstruct, it is by which we reassemble the information in our schema, redoing the order of your schema. Meron daw kang bagong information. You decided to deconstruct it kasi ay minano din ako sa iyang bago. Garo sala si schema ko, sala si pakaaram ko dati, sala si order. Order lang, but mayo kan sala. Sorry, mayo kan sala pero si order sa payo mo, si process sa payo mo kay puan baguhon. So that's what we call deconstruct. You then deconstruct your schema to entertain the new learning. Next is complexify. Okay, complexify, it is by which it is by which the new learning will add more depth and density to your schema. You already know this. But after hearing the phonetic utterance, you then know more about that topic. Mayo kang tighiro, tigdagdagan mo lang siya. Basically, adding depth. Yun nga, adding depth, deeper. Okay? Next is revise. It is when we delete a portion of our schema and then replace it with a new one. Sala pala si pakaintindi ko sa last part. Dapat pala arog gani. Okay? May portion sa pagkakaintindi mo sa store memory sa memory bank mo sa payo mo, may sala pala na part. And then you try to revise it by deleting the part that is wrong and then replacing it with a correct part. Okay? Next is unlearn. Unlearn, it is when we delete the entire schema because it was proven wrong. Wala ka nang i-edit. Napatunayan na mali yung pagkakaintindi mo or yung mali yung konsepto mo, then you decide to delete the whole idea. Okay? So, naniniwala ka kay Santa Claus. And then you realize it's just a fantasy. Tadang! Unlearn. Hindi pala totoo si Santa Claus. Okay? Next is reject. Okay? It is when the processed information is rejected and stimulus did not affect the listener. Okay? Walang effect sa iyo. Na-process mo siya all throughout, pero still, hindi ka convinced. It's not true, it's not correct, it's not good. So you reject the information. You don't accept it in your memory. So pipili lang dyan kung anong mangyayari sa utak mo. Can you control this? Somehow yes, somehow no. Uh, it's both in your control, but somehow it's also not in your control. Kasi this is metacognitive. Okay? So, yan. So I think we come to an impasse. We'll connect this with speaking. So activities for these parts are in your module, in your group page. Okay. So thank you for watching. Make sure to click the bell below in the YouTube. Okay. Write your question on our page or send me an email, christophermagellan.reta@cbsua.edu.ph. Also, please accomplish the activity on this topic, which I sent um, earlier to this, before October 26, 2020. So, October 25, my submission. Submissions can be done using your VLP, Facebook page, or Messenger, email, or flash drive. Okay? So, dun pa. Stay safe always. Okay? So, we are done with nature and concept of listening. Thank you for watching. Bye.